Mr. Tony Benn, it's a pleasure to have you. I'd just like to start with a quote you said once. You once said, I'd like to be remembered as someone who encouraged people, that is all. When I talk to young people, I say, I owe you an apology, because my generation made such a mock of the world, killing 100 million people in 2 world wars. Your generation has to get it right. This was one of your sayings. Just to start, how can we get it right as our generation? How can we overcome these problems?
Well, we're going through a very difficult period at the moment. The world economy is in a very uncertain state. A lot of people are out of work, a lot of suffering. The world is running out of food and oil and water. And so this generation has to face a situation, a global situation, which requires a lot of imagination. And I think the first thing to realise is that we're all members of the human race. When I was young, we were taught that the world was made up of the British and foreigners, and there were a lot of foreigners, but now we're all members of the human race. And my grandchildren, who went to a school with 70 nationalities at the school, they realise that. They don't imagine anyone as foreign, we're all the same. And I think if we can get that right, then we should be able to tackle the problems that we have to face.
Absolutely. You were possessed from a very young age and privileged enough to meet Mahatma Gandhi in 1931. How has this affected your life in politics?
Well, I think the 3 greatest influences on our period of history, not one have been white and not one have been European. Mahatma Gandhi, Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu. These are the people who have provided moral guidance. And Gandhi believed in non-violence, which is tremendously important. Mandela believed in human equality. And Desmond Tutu believed that truth would relax the tensions that we have. And so I feel I've learned a lot from them.
And have they inspired your life in politics?
Well, they have in a way. They've greatly influenced my thinking. I'm not, for example, in favour of war crimes trials, because I think Tutu is right, that if you bring out the truth, then you can find that people understand each other better. And also, I think non-violence is an instrument for change. Look at what's happening in the Arab world now. You realise that these things have got to be resolved peacefully.
Absolutely. I mean, you're seen as a leading politician at many polls and leading left-wing politician. So, in a way, you'll have the same effect as somebody like Gandhi or Nelson Mandela in terms of British politics. What do you think of that?
Well, I don't put myself in that category, no. I've learned a great deal in my life and tried to convey my views to people, just as my contribution to the debate, and to listen to them. But there are huge problems that have to be faced. And I think when you think of starvation in Somalia and then 2 wars going on, you realise the human race has got to abandon war and move towards the development of human justice and freedom and so on.
Absolutely. With regards to Gandhi, he was obviously very successful and very influential even today. Do you think he would have been as successful had he been from a less advantaged background and not so popular with the British?
Well, he was so popular with the British. The British government always imprisoning Mr. Gandhi. But Gandhi believed in his cause, which was Indian independence, and he always had some support in Britain. And I think the fact that there was support for Gandhi in Britain added strength to his campaigns. When he was in London in 1931, a journalist said to him, "What do you think of civilization in Britain?" And Mr. Gandhi said, "I think it would be a very good idea."
You have often argued that we must be wary of anybody with power, that no one with power likes democracy. What do you mean by this?
Well, if you meet a powerful person, ask him 5 questions. What power have you got? Where did you get it from? In whose interest do you exercise it? To whom are you accountable? And how can we get rid of you? And if you can't get rid of powerful people, they may be brilliant, but you don't live in a democracy. And therefore, people have to have the right to change governments and replace them with new governments. And we have to think of this now on a world scale. And there's so many obstacles to it. I mean, one of the problems at the moment is religious differences, you know, the Islamophobia that has been whipped up in Norway and which is present everywhere, is a deadly danger because all the world's religions taught people how to live in peace. And we should use the world's religions as the basis of unity and not a basis of hostility.
With regards to being wary of anybody with power and people who have power and their dislike for democracy, as you've said, do you think this is true of the ruling coalition government?
Well, the present government is a product of the last election in Britain, where no party was given a majority. So the Conservatives did a deal with the Liberals, and that is really a Conservative government with Liberal support. And it is a product of the way people voted in the last election. But coalitions are not very good because they weaken one party, and I don't think they're doing the Liberals any good, and I think probably they're not helping the Conservatives all that.
You're against war, obviously, and you've campaigned against the Iraq war. In your opinion, what would have been the right course of action, moral course of action in Iraq?
Well, I think that the decision to go to war with Iraq was a war crime. It wasn't authorised by the United Nations. It was what President Bush wanted to do, and Mr. Blair went along with it. And a lot of people died, and I think it caused a great deal of trouble. And somehow we have to get back to the idea of discussing with people what the differences are and finding an answer, and not thinking that killing is the right answer. But a lot of people died in Iraq over the years, and I don't believe our bombing of Iraq helped.
But what would you have us done?
Well, I think you just have to negotiate with people and try to work out a sensible way of dealing with the problems. But the killing didn't really help. And then, of course, Saddam was removed and executed, and I don't know whether that helped either.
To what extent do you think this is a result of racism?
Well, I'm not a great expert on Tottenham, but a young man was shot, and that triggered something to do with it. And then other people came in and looted and burned. And so I think there was a real problem that was accelerated by other elements who just went into it for personal gain, and that has to be dealt with. But where there is an injustice, and I think perhaps the killing of Mark Duggan was an injustice, it has to be dealt with very, very quickly and effectively by the police and the courts. And if you don't deal with it, then you provide an excuse for other people to come along and make more trouble.
Do you think it's right for people to be rioting and causing trouble, looting, causing damage to local businesses?
Oh, I think where you have violence of the kind we saw in Tottenham, it does enormous amount of damage, costs a lot of money, deprives people of jobs and security, and that has to be dealt with by policies pursued by governments. But at the same time, you cannot allow looting to go on, and therefore if there is looting, then the police have to deal with it.
How has this affected your perception of war in general?
Well, my view of war is based on such experiences I have. When I was 15 years old, I was living in London during the Blitzkrieg, when every night the Germans came over and bombed London, and I used to look out of the window at home and see the German bombers going over and see London burning. 500 people were killed near where I lived. Every night we went to the shelter. And I hate war. My brother died and many of my friends died in the war. And when the United Nations was set up in 1945, the words written in my heart, it said, "We, the peoples of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has caused untold suffering to mankind." That was the great hope I had when I was 20. And the United Nations hasn't realised everything I hoped for, but it is better than war as a solution to problems.
Absolutely. You're one of the few UK politicians to have become more left-wing after holding ministerial office, given most people term more right-wing or conservative. Why have you gone against the status quo?
Well, I think it's the experience when you're a minister. I was a Labour minister, and I realised when we got there the real power was elsewhere. The banks had a lot of power, the media had a lot of power, and although we said we would do things, we were finding it very hard to do. And so I regard my process of moving to the left as part of my education. And I think the public understand that there isn't much difference between the parties, and they want something different done, and therefore they look to people to do what they said they would do, and the Labour Party didn't do that.
In terms of growing right-wing political ideologies across Europe, in Germany, France, Switzerland with the Bannerman and minarets, there seems to be a focus on Muslims and this growing tide of Islamophobia. What do you attribute this to?
Well, I think it's very simple that political leaders want power, and if they want power, they tell people they're being attacked by another group, and they build up support for themselves on the basis of being hostile to the group that they think are threatening us. I mean, Hitler did it with the Jews, and people did it in America and South Africa against the black community. And now a lot of it is directed against the Muslims. But I believe that Muslims are preaching the same policy of peace and love that Christians and Jews practice. And we should use this as find the basis of some common theology, and resist all the attempts to warn people about Islam.
Absolutely. But do you believe this growing tide of Islamophobia, is this a part of a wider racism that hasn't been confronted in Europe?
Yes, I think it is a form of racism, and it's a form of fear, and it's very frightening, and it divides people at home, because a lot of Muslims live in Britain. And then there's the so-called influence of Islam elsewhere. And we have to be very, very careful. We don't allow those ideas to get a grip. So attacking Islamophobia is a very important political process for us to follow in Britain.
With regards to the recent events in Norway and the attacks in Oslo, do you believe the attacker, Breivik, he cited multiculturalism as one of his biggest motivations for his attacks? Is Europe in a so-called multicultural dilemma?
Well, I'm very puzzled by what happened in Oslo, because the one thing is clear, that Norway is not threatened by Islam in any way. And this man who did it, I think, is mad. He said he was protecting Norway from Islam and from Marxism. Well, Islam and Marxism are not the same. And then he went and killed a lot of children. And so I think we mustn't take that as being more than a warning about using Islam as an enemy. But I think the man who did it was mad.
Absolutely. I mean, the media outlets across the world, they, as soon as the news was out, they assumed it was an Islamic attack, and they had to withdraw their comments afterwards. They assumed, but once it came out that it was a so-called native Norwegian, they had to withdraw their comments that it was an Islamic attack. What do you think of it?
Yes, it's not a credible argument. The argument this man used is not credible. Islam does not threaten Norway. And this idea that he is protecting Norwegian independence from Islam is ridiculous.
And a growing Eurabia, as he called it.
Yeah.
Okay. So how do you think we can overcome this growing tide of Islamophobia?
Well, I think first of all you have to work on the basis of the common interest of survival. We live in a small world which is running out of things we need, and we have to find a common solution. So we have a common interest with the Muslim world and with everybody. And if you do that, then you have to build that into local communities. So if there is an example of Islamophobia in London, then you have to resist it and warn people of the danger of it. And if you build good personal relations, then you can build a strong campaign against Islamophobia. And it's a big task, because it raises psychological questions as well. If you can frighten people, you could get power over them. And we mustn't allow that to happen.
in France, in various other countries, where there have been bans on religious headgear or minarets. So it has a lot to do with institutionalized racism. So I think we need to, do you not think we need to overcome this at the top level before it's...
Well, I think if you think, and that is true, there is institutional racism, the ban on people wearing headscarves and so on is an example of that. But I think you deal with that by campaigns against it. All change comes when people get together and say no, and then governments have to listen. But of course, if it is institutional and it's in the society, then it's a bigger campaign you're engaged in. But I think it also meets people's needs, because most people are not tempted by Islamophobia. I've never met anyone who's really frightened of Islam taking over Britain, or it's just suits the purpose of political leaders who want to build power for themselves.
Do you believe that?
Well, the story of Murdoch is about the media. The media are enormously powerful. In the Western world, the media form the same role as religion does in other parts of the world. People get their information from one source, in the case of News International, from the Times, the Sunday Times, the Sun, the News of the World, from the Sky Television. And this provides the man who owns these papers with a great deal of power, and he uses that power to produce the political results he wants. So we have now to recover the right of people to listen to what they want to listen to, and the internet makes a big difference. You can listen on the internet and you'll hear information that isn't owned by Rupert Murdoch. You hear from other people and you begin thinking about it. But I do believe that the freedom of information, real freedom, means you have a variety of views and you can make up your own mind.
I mean, many thought it was a very stable tower, the Murdoch Tower, and do you believe, I mean, did you think it was ever going to crumble down as it did, in essence?
Well, it was interesting the way it did crumble. Mind you, it hasn't completely crumbled, because Murdoch is still a very rich man. He owns newspapers in Australia and in America. He broadcasts in China on television. He still owns many papers in Britain. But it did weaken his control over political leaders, because whereas in the old days political leaders always went to Murdoch and talked to him in the hope that he would support them, now political leaders are going to be very careful about being seen with Murdoch. So I think it has produced a change, but it's only the beginning of a change.
It's small, but it's still quite
very
small.
big, small change, yes.
How much control should the government have over the media, and would this be a breach of English civil liberties?
No, I don't think the government should control the press, because the press, an independent newspaper, is an independent voice. But I think it's reasonable for the government to say that no one man should own more than one newspaper. I think if you say you can own one newspaper but you can't own four, that would provide a greater diversity of opinion. But of course, with the social media now, the internet and Facebook and Twitter, there are many opportunities for people to hear a different view, and I think that is one factor that's explained the Arab uprising.
Moving on to the Arab uprising, do you think it will ever be possible for them to achieve their own models of democracy without Western control?
Well, I think everybody has to fight their own battles. You can't intervene in another country to produce liberty. That's the problem with the Libyan war. Everybody has a responsibility to secure freedom for themselves, and if they do that, then they come together with others who've done it, and then you build an international opinion, and out of the international opinion come international institutions which will solve the world's problems. But obviously you want to encourage people who are seeking freedom.
To what extent are Western democracies like Britain a good role model for emerging Arab democracies in the region?
Well, I think you have to be very critical. Our democracy is a limited one. We don't elect the House of Lords, we don't elect the head of state. We have a very rigid medieval system which has been modernised to some extent, and I wouldn't expect other countries to follow us, but I think the one thing that really does matter is that the ultimate power is seen to belong in the people and not in a group in the government. And if you have people's control, then the likelihood of the abuse of power is reduced.
Turkey in the Middle East has often been cited as an inspiration for the countries undergoing revolutions in the region. Do you believe Turkey is a good role model for these countries?
Do I?
Turkey, do you believe it's a good role model? It's often cited as an inspiration for...
Well, I think everybody has to find it their own way, and in by discussion in a country of what's going on. I mean, if I lived in Syria now, I would be saying, how do you deal with Assad? How do we get a choice? If I lived in Egypt, are the military too strong? If I lived in Libya, how do I deal with Gaddafi? And what the rest of the world can do is provide support and encouragement, but everyone has to win their own rights.
So
there's no alternative to doing it yourself.
How much power do you think British people really exercise? How much power do you really have?
Well, they do have the power to remove a government, but to replace it by a party which is very similar. And I think people are suspicious because they say Parliament is a club and they're all the same and so on. And so you have to see the battles being fought at an ideological level. I think all the campaigns for peace and against the cuts and for freedom and against Islamophobia, these have an impact on public opinion which will work their way through the political system over the years. I mean, I think, for example, slavery. I mean, how did slavery end? One slave said to himself, who gave the slave owner the right to do this to me? And once he began asking that question, he was beginning to create the movement against slavery, and then that worked its way out.
So we need to challenge accepted.
I think it's when people do something that's the key thing. All history is made by people doing something.
How has the current Israeli nation lived up to these ideals?
Well, I don't think there's a parallel between Zionism and socialism, but of course the treatment of the Jews by Hitler created a demand for some Jews to have somewhere to live, and the Americans supported it, and that's how Zionism came. And then after the Jews went into Palestine, then they declared a state and the Americans supported it. And now Israel is a nuclear-armed state. It's the most powerful state in the Middle East. And it has denied the Palestinians their rights. And so I think that is a national issue. It has to be dealt with. But socialism must mean, it must mean more democracy at every level. And if you don't have democracy, you won't get the right solution.
Obviously, you regard yourself as a socialist, and do you think it's possible in Britain, socialism?
Well, if I take one example, the National Health Service is the most socialist thing we ever did. Free health care for everybody. It's also the most popular thing we ever did. So I think if you look at what makes progress, it's where you have greater democratic control, where you share the power or give the power to the people as a whole in cooperative movements and so on.
Going back to the Israeli-Palestinian question, how do you believe that this problem can ever be overcome? Do you think it's possible?
Well, I think the Palestinians are very determined not to give up, and they have a lot of support in the Middle East. More support now the Arab revolt is going on, because the old regimes in the Middle East were very pro-American and the Americans were very pro-Zionist, and so those Arab countries didn't have the influence they had. Now they're becoming free. I think they will have greater influence, and I think there have to be campaigns. I mean, I support the Palestinians. I opposed the attack on Gaza, and I support the Palestinians, and a lot of people in Britain do now. And I think as that support builds up internationally, then the Israeli government will realise that they will have to change their policy.
Yeah, I had a question. 1948 when India got independence. What did you think about the split between Pakistan and India? Do you think that, some people say it was Britain's way of kind of keeping control over the subcontinent?
No, it wasn't. The British didn't want the split, but the people who played a leading part in Pakistan demanded it. And Mr. Gandhi was very much opposed to the division. But where you had a lot of opposition to unity, then it broke down, and it is something that still has to be resolved in some way.
And do you think the empire really fell, or do you think it just kind of emerged through globalization?
Well, the British Empire disappeared after the war when India became independent, Pakistan, Bangladesh became independent, and so on. And that left Britain as an ex-empire, and we have a Commonwealth where we just work together. Yeah. But America is now the biggest empire in the world, and we are in a very different position, and we have to campaign for what we want by political means and argument.